James Hayes reported his wife missing in February 2022, telling investigators she'd fallen victim to an avalanche during their ski vacation. Despite extensive searches, her body was never recovered, and he filed a $3 million life insurance claim. The case remained unsolved until Christmas morning, when a family in a different state was watching their vacation videos. Their teenage son's drone footage from that same resort showed something impossible to ignore. Two people standing on a forbidden peak, and one of them pushing the other over the edge. The date matched Victoria's disappearance perfectly. This is the story of how a Christmas tradition and a teenage boy's hobby solved a murder that investigators thought would remain cold forever. A story of wealth, betrayal, greed, and the unexpected power of technology to reveal truth when everything else has failed. February 2022. Aspen Summit Resort, Colorado. One of the most exclusive ski destinations in the American West, where luxury chalets overlook pristine slopes and the wealthy came to escape their complicated lives. James Hayes, 45 years old, was a commercial real estate developer from Chicago who had built a fortune buying distressed properties and converting them into high-end residential complexes. His wife, Victoria, 42, had been a corporate attorney before retiring early to focus on philanthropy in their social life. They had no children, just the two of them in a sprawling lakefront home in Winnetka, living the kind of life that appeared perfect from the outside. But appearances, as this story will show, can be devastatingly deceptive. James and Victoria's marriage had been crumbling for years, though few people knew it. They maintained their public image carefully, attending charity galas together, hosting dinner parties, taking luxury vacations that they documented on social media. Behind closed doors, however, the relationship had become a cold arrangement of convenience. Victoria had discovered, 6 months before their final ski trip, that James's business empire was built on a foundation of fraud. He'd been misrepresenting property values to lenders, inflating appraisals, and pocketing the difference in loan amounts. She'd accidentally found the documentation while helping him organize tax records, and the discovery had shattered whatever remained of her trust in him. Victoria had given him an ultimatum. She wanted him to liquidate his holdings, make restitution to the lenders he'd defrauded, and turn himself in to federal authorities. If he refused, she would go to the FBI herself. James had stalled for months, promising he would do the right thing, buying time while he made very different plans. Because Victoria didn't know about the $3 million life insurance policy James had taken out on her life just 8 months earlier. And she didn't know that her husband had decided that losing everything to prison and disgrace was unacceptable when there was another option. The ski vacation had been James's suggestion. One last trip together, he'd told her, before they dealt with the legal consequences of his actions. Victoria had been hesitant but ultimately agreed, hoping that perhaps the trip would give them time to reconnect before their lives fell apart. She had no way of knowing that James had already researched Aspen Summit Resort's terrain, identifying the remote and dangerous areas where accidents happened with tragic regularity. She had no way of knowing that he'd planned every detail of what he would later claim was a spontaneous decision to explore an off-limits area. She trusted him, and that trust would cost her everything. They arrived at Aspen Summit on February 10th, checking into a suite at the resort's main lodge. The first few days passed normally. They skied the marked trails, had dinner at expensive restaurants, and from the outside looked like any other wealthy couple enjoying a winter getaway. But James was waiting for the right moment, the right conditions. He needed it to look like an accident, needed there to be a plausible explanation for why they'd been in a restricted area. He'd studied weather reports, avalanche forecasts, and the resort's history of accidents. And on Valentine's Day, February 14th, conditions were perfect. That morning, James suggested they ski to an area called Eagles Ridge, a spectacular viewpoint that required hiking beyond the resort's boundary into backcountry terrain. Victoria was reluctant. The area was marked as restricted, dangerous for anyone without proper avalanche safety equipment. But James insisted it would be safe, that he'd researched the route, that it would be a romantic gesture for Valentine's Day to see the sunrise from that elevation. Victoria finally agreed, trusting her husband's judgment despite her misgivings. They set out early, before dawn, carrying minimal equipment. James had deliberately not brought avalanche transceivers or safety gear, later explaining that he'd forgotten them in their rush to catch the sunrise. What Victoria didn't know was that James had been planning this moment for weeks. He'd identified Eagles Ridge specifically because it was remote, dangerous, and had a sheer drop of over 300 feet on its eastern face. He'd timed their departure to ensure they'd be alone before other backcountry skiers began their day. And he'd chosen Valentine's Day deliberately, knowing that the romantic gesture would seem believable to investigators later, would explain why they'd taken the risk of going into restricted terrain. But James Hayes made a critical mistake in his planning. He'd been so focused on the location, the timing, and his alibi that he never considered the possibility that someone else might be in that remote area at that exact time. Filming from the air. Tyler West was 14 years old, visiting Aspen Summit Resort with his family for their annual winter vacation. His father, Ryan Mitchell, was a software engineer from Portland, Oregon, and his mother, Megan Phillips, taught high school biology. They'd saved for a year to afford the trip, and Tyler had been especially excited because his parents had given him an early birthday present: a high-end camera drone with 4K video capability and impressive range. Tyler was fascinated by aerial photography and had spent months watching YouTube tutorials on how to capture stunning landscape shots. On the morning of February 14th, Tyler woke up before his parents, eager to test his drone in the crisp mountain air before the resort became crowded. He dressed quietly, grabbed his equipment, and took the resort's shuttle to one of the higher elevation parking areas where he'd have a clear view and plenty of space to fly. He launched the drone around 6:15 in the morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise, sending it up to capture the spectacular mountain panorama. The drone's camera was recording continuously as Tyler experimented with different angles and elevations, panning across the snow-covered peaks. At 6:42 a.m., Tyler's drone was hovering at about 400 feet elevation, facing northeast toward Eagles Ridge. Tyler himself was focused on adjusting camera settings on his controller, not really watching the live video feed carefully. The drone's automated recording captured everything. Two small figures on Eagles Ridge, barely visible against the snow. The figures were standing near the cliff edge, and even in the distant footage, you could see them clearly if you knew what to look for. One figure suddenly moved, arms extending forward. The other figure stumbled backward, arms flailing, and disappeared over the edge. The first figure stood there for a moment, looking down, then turned and walked away in the opposite direction. Tyler never noticed any of this at the time. He was recording hours of footage, and the two figures on Eagles Ridge were just tiny dots in a vast landscape. He brought his drone back after about 30 minutes, pleased with what he'd captured, and returned to the resort to have breakfast with his family. The memory card with that morning's footage went into his backpack, and Tyler didn't think about it again for 10 months. Meanwhile, on Eagles Ridge, James Hayes was executing the rest of his plan. After pushing Victoria off the cliff, he'd waited 5 minutes to ensure she couldn't have survived the fall. Then he'd begun the performance that he'd rehearsed in his mind dozens of times. He skied quickly back toward the resort boundary, making sure to create visible tracks in the snow. When he reached an area where he had cell phone coverage, he called resort security in a panic. His wife had fallen while they were hiking to Eagles Ridge. She'd been ahead of him, he'd heard her scream, and when he got to the spot where she'd been, she was gone. He thought there might have been an avalanche, or she might have fallen through a cornice. He needed help immediately. The response was swift and professional. Aspen Summit Resort had experienced search and rescue protocols, and within 30 minutes, teams were mobilizing. Ski patrol, avalanche rescue specialists, and local law enforcement all converged on the area James had described. The search continued throughout the day and into the evening, expanding to cover a wide radius around Eagles Ridge. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging flew over the area. Trained search dogs covered the terrain, but Victoria's body wasn't found. The eastern face of Eagles Ridge, where she'd actually fallen, was an area of extreme avalanche danger, with unstable snow conditions, and rescuers couldn't safely access it during the initial search. James played his role perfectly. He was the devastated husband, refusing to leave the search area, insisting on helping despite being told by rescuers to return to the lodge. He gave interview after interview to local news media, pleading for information, thanking the search teams, expressing his anguish and guilt for having suggested the hike. To everyone watching, he appeared to be a man destroyed by the loss of his wife. And perhaps part of him was because even as James executed his plan, even as he successfully convinced everyone around him that this was a tragic accident, there was a part of him that knew he'd murdered the woman he'd once loved. That knowledge would haunt him, though not enough to confess. The search continued for 2 weeks before being officially suspended. The area where Victoria had last been seen was simply too dangerous, with avalanche risk too high, to justify continued efforts. The official determination was that Victoria Hayes had likely fallen in the backcountry and been buried by subsequent snow or avalanche activity. Her body would likely be recovered during the spring thaw when conditions were safer. James returned to Chicago, playing the grieving widower, accepting condolences from friends and business associates who had no reason to doubt his story. But one person did have doubts. Detective Samantha Ward of the Pitkin County Sheriff's Office had been called to assist with the investigation, and something about James Hayes' story bothered her from the beginning. The timing seemed too convenient, the lack of proper safety equipment too negligent for someone who claimed to have researched the route. And when Samantha ran a background check on James, she discovered the recent $3 million life insurance policy. She also discovered, through careful investigation, the fraud allegations that Victoria had been preparing to bring to federal authorities. Samantha was convinced this was murder, not an accident, but without a body, without witnesses, without any physical evidence of foul play, she had no basis for charges. The case remained officially classified as a missing person presumed dead, but Samantha kept it open in her active files, hoping that spring would bring both Victoria's body and the evidence she needed to prove James had killed his wife. Spring came, and the snow melted, but Victoria's body didn't appear. Search teams combed the area again with the cadaver dogs and used ground-penetrating radar to search beneath remaining snow and ice. They found nothing. It was as if Victoria Hayes had simply vanished into the mountain. By June 2022, even Samantha had to admit that the body might never be recovered. The terrain on Eagles Ridge was unstable, prone to rock slides and avalanches. It was possible that Victoria's remains had been swept away by snow movement, buried under rock debris, or scattered by predators. Without a body, Samantha knew she'd never get a conviction for murder, regardless of her suspicions. James Hayes, meanwhile, had begun the process of having Victoria declared legally dead. Under Colorado law, when someone disappears under circumstances suggesting death, the waiting period can be shortened with sufficient evidence. James presented the search reports, witness statements from rescue personnel, and expert testimony about survival and possibility in the conditions Victoria had faced. By September 2022, 7 months after Victoria's disappearance, a Colorado court declared her legally dead. James filed his insurance claim within a week, $3 million. The insurance company investigated, of course, interviewing Detective Ward among others, but without evidence of criminal activity, they had no grounds to deny the claim. The policy was paid out in full by October. Detective Ward watched this unfold with frustration and anger. She knew in her gut that James Hayes had gotten away with murder, but knowing something and proving it are very different things. She kept the case file on her desk, reviewing it periodically, hoping for a break that seemed like it would never come. The case was cold, and it appeared it would stay that way. But across the country, in Portland, Oregon, the evidence that would break the case wide open was sitting on a memory card in a teenage boy's camera bag, waiting to be discovered. December 2022. 10 months after Victoria Hayes had disappeared, 10 months after James Hayes had collected $3 million for murdering his wife, 10 months after Detective Samantha Ward had reluctantly accepted that justice might never be served. The Christmas season had arrived, and in Portland, the Mitchell Phillips household was preparing for their traditional Christmas morning celebration. Ryan, Megan, and their son Tyler had a ritual they followed every year. After opening presents, they'd make a big breakfast together, and then they'd spend the afternoon looking through all the photos and videos they'd taken during the year, reminiscing about their adventures and experiences. Tyler had largely forgotten about the drone footage from their February ski trip to Aspen. He'd been disappointed with most of it, feeling that his shots hadn't been as impressive as he'd hoped, and he'd never gotten around to editing it into anything worth posting online. The memory card had been sitting in a drawer in his room for months, and he probably wouldn't have remembered it at all except that his mother had specifically asked him to gather all the family's vacation footage so they could put together a year-end compilation video. On Christmas morning, after presents had been opened and breakfast consumed, the family settled into the living room with their laptops and the big screen TV. Tyler connected his laptop to the television and began playing through the various video files from their year. Summer camping trip footage, his sister's soccer games, his mother's birthday dinner. And then he came to the Aspen files. The first few clips were basic resort shots, scenic views of the slopes, some footage of Tyler and his sister skiing, and then the February 14th morning file began playing. The footage was beautiful. Golden sunrise light hitting the snow-covered peaks, long shadows, the kind of scenic beauty that made Colorado famous. Tyler's father, Ryan, was watching with interest, commenting on the composition and suggesting Tyler should definitely use this in his compilation. Megan was scrolling through her phone, half paying attention. The footage continued, the drone slowly panning across the mountain landscape. And then Megan looked up at the screen and said something that would change everything. "Pause that. What was that?" Tyler hit pause, confused. "What was what?" Megan leaned forward, staring at the screen. "Go back like 10 seconds and play it again." Slowly. Tyler rewound the footage and played it in slow motion. On the screen, in the distance, near what appeared to be a ridge or cliff edge, there were two small figures. They were barely visible, just dark specks against the white snow, but they were definitely human shapes. "Are those people?" Ryan asked, moving closer to the TV. "That area looks pretty remote. I wonder if they're lost." The footage played in slow motion. The two figures were standing close together near the cliff edge. And then, unmistakably, one figure's arms extended forward. The other figure's arms went up, flailing, and the figure fell backward and disappeared. The first figure stood motionless for several seconds, then turned and walked away. The room was completely silent. Tyler felt ice water run down his spine. "Did we just see someone fall off a cliff?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Megan grabbed Ryan's arm. Oh my God, Ryan! That person just pushed the other person off. That was not an accident. That was deliberate." Ryan was already reaching for his phone. "What's the date on this file?" Tyler checked the file properties. February 14th, 2022. Timestamp says 6:42 a.m. Ryan was searching on his phone, his fingers moving quickly. February 14th, Aspen Summit Resort. Let me see if there were any incidents reported. It took him less than 2 minutes to find the news stories. Woman missing after backcountry skiing accident at Aspen Summit Resort. Victoria Hayes, 42, disappeared February 14th during a hike with her husband to Eagles Ridge area. Extensive search operation yields no results. Body presumed lost in avalanche or terrain. Ryan looked up from his phone, his face pale. This is the same resort. The same date, Eagles Ridge. That must be where Tyler's drone footage is from. Megan was already on her own phone, calling the local police non-emergency line. "We need to report this. This is evidence. That woman didn't die in an avalanche. We just watched someone murder her." The Portland police connected them to the FBI, who connected them to Detective Samantha Ward in Colorado. By December 26, less than 24 hours after the Mitchell Phillips family had made their discovery, Tyler's drone footage was in the hands of investigators who had spent 10 months hoping for exactly this kind of break. Samantha Ward watched the footage a dozen times, her hands shaking as she realized what she was seeing. The figures were distant, but enhancement technology could work miracles. She sent the footage to the FBI's Digital Forensics Unit with a request for urgent analysis. She needed confirmation that those figures were human, that the location matched Eagles Ridge, and most importantly, if there was any way to identify the individuals in the footage. The forensics team worked through the holidays, and by New Year's Eve, they had their answers. Advanced image enhancement and analysis confirmed everything. The location was definitely Eagles Ridge, matching the exact area where James Hayes claimed his wife had disappeared. The timestamp on the footage was 6:42 a.m. on February 14th, which was consistent with the timeline James had given in his initial statements. The two figures were human, approximately adult-sized based on comparison with known landmarks in the frame. And most damning of all, the enhanced footage clearly showed one figure pushing the other, followed by the victim falling backward off the cliff. The forensics team went further. Using sophisticated comparison software, they analyzed the build, height, and movement patterns of the figures and compared them to known footage and photos of James and Victoria Hayes. The taller figure matched James's proportions. The shorter figure matched Victoria's. The clothing visible in the enhanced footage matched descriptions James had given of what they'd been wearing that day. This wasn't just evidence of a murder, it was evidence of James Hayes murdering his wife. Detective Samantha Ward got the report on January 3, 2023. She immediately contacted the FBI and the Colorado District Attorney's Office. An arrest warrant was prepared. But there was one more piece of evidence they needed before confronting James Hayes. They needed Victoria's body, because James could potentially argue that the figure in the footage had survived the fall, that he'd panicked and left the scene, but that Victoria had died from exposure or other causes. To prove murder, they needed to establish that the fall James had caused was fatal. The spring thaw was still months away, but Detective Ward wasn't willing to wait that long. She contacted specialized search and rescue teams who used advanced technology to locate avalanche victims and remains. Using the drone footage to identify the exact location of the fall, teams deployed ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging equipment to search the base of Eagles Ridge's eastern face. They were looking for anything that might indicate human remains beneath the snow and ice. It took 3 weeks of painstaking searching in brutal winter conditions. But on January 24, 2023, the teams got a hit. Radar signature consistent with human remains is approximately 80 feet below the snow surface, at the base of the cliff face. Recovery operation began immediately. By January 28th, Victoria Hayes' body had been recovered. She'd been preserved by the cold, her injuries consistent with a fatal fall from significant height. The medical examiner determined that she'd died on impact, suffering massive trauma from hitting the rocks at the cliff base. There was no evidence of avalanche burial or exposure. She'd simply fallen or been pushed from the cliff and died instantly. Now Detective Ward had everything she needed: a body, forensic evidence of how Victoria died, and video footage showing James Hayes pushing his wife off that cliff. On February 1, 2023, almost exactly 1 year after Victoria's murder, FBI agents and Colorado State Police arrested James Hayes at his Chicago office. He was charged with first-degree murder, insurance fraud, and conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming. The drone footage was played in court during preliminary hearings, enhanced to show as much detail as possible. James's defense attorneys tried to argue that the footage was inconclusive, that it was impossible to identify the individuals, that it showed an accident, not a deliberate act. But the prosecution had more than just the drone footage. They had James's financial records showing the insurance policy taken out months before the murder. They had evidence of the fraud scheme Victoria had discovered. They had testimony from friends who described James's increasing desperation as Victoria prepared to go to authorities. They had the detailed timeline showing that James had researched Eagles Ridge specifically, had chosen Valentine's Day deliberately, had forgotten safety equipment that any experienced backcountry skier would have brought. And most damningly, they had James's own statements from the initial investigation, where he claimed Victoria had been ahead of him when she fell, that he hadn't seen what happened. The drone footage proved that was a lie. He'd been standing right next to her. His hands had been on her. In the face of such overwhelming evidence, James Hayes' attorneys advised him to negotiate a plea deal. James refused at first, maintaining his innocence, insisting the whole thing was a tragic misunderstanding. But as the trial date approached and the prosecution's case became clearer, reality set in. He was going to be convicted. The question was only whether he had faced the death penalty or life in prison. In July 2023, 5 months after his arrest, James Hayes accepted a plea agreement. He would plead guilty to first-degree murder and insurance fraud in exchange for the prosecution agreeing not to seek the death penalty. The plea hearing was emotional and tense. Victoria's family, who had traveled from the East Coast, sat in the front row of the courtroom, waiting to hear James finally tell the truth. Victoria's sister, Abigail Ross, had prepared a victim impact statement that she'd been waiting months to deliver. The judge asked James if he understood the charges and the consequences of his plea. James answered yes. The judge asked if he was pleading guilty because he was in fact guilty of the crimes charged. And James Hayes, the man who had spent more than a year maintaining his innocence, the man who had cried on television about his missing wife, the man who had collected $3 million for murdering her, finally broke. "Yes," he said, his voice barely audible. "I killed her. I pushed her off that cliff. I planned it for weeks. I knew exactly what I was doing." The courtroom erupted. Victoria's family was sobbing. James's own attorney put a hand on his shoulder, trying to calm him, but James kept talking. "I couldn't go to prison for the fraud. I couldn't lose everything. The insurance money would let me start over, disappear if I needed to. I thought I'd planned everything perfectly. The location, the timing, the story about the avalanche. I never thought anyone would be up there filming. I never thought anyone would see what I did." He looked toward Victoria's family. "I'm sorry. I know that means nothing, but I am sorry. She didn't deserve any of this. She was trying to make me do the right thing, and I killed her for it." The judge sentenced James Hayes to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional consecutive sentences for the insurance fraud charges. He was transferred to a maximum security facility in Colorado, where he will spend the rest of his life. The $3 million insurance payout was seized by the court and awarded to Victoria's estate, which her family used to establish a foundation in her name providing legal services to fraud victims. Detective Samantha Ward attended the sentencing, finally able to close the case that had haunted her for more than a year. And Tyler West, the teenage boy whose drone footage had solved a murder, received commendations from both the FBI and the Colorado authorities for his family's civic responsibility in coming forward with the evidence. The case became something of a sensation in true crime circles, a story about how modern technology and family traditions could combine to deliver justice. Tyler gave several interviews to local news outlets, always emphasizing that the discovery had been completely accidental, that he'd just been a kid testing out his new drone. But the footage he'd captured that had become a pivotal piece of evidence in a murder case, proof that even when someone thinks they've committed the perfect crime, technology can be watching from places they never considered. For Victoria Hayes' family, the resolution brought a complicated mix of relief and renewed grief. They finally knew what had happened to Victoria, finally had her body to bury properly. But they also had to confront the reality that someone they'd trusted, someone who had been part of their family, had coldly and deliberately murdered Victoria for money. Her sister Abigail spoke at several victim advocacy events, talking about how financial fraud and domestic violence often intersected, how Victoria had been trying to do the right thing and had paid with her life. The foundation established in Victoria's name has helped hundreds of fraud victims seek justice, turning her tragedy into something that could help others. Detective Samantha Ward retired from the sheriff's office in 2024, but she kept a photo on her desk in her home office. It's an enhanced still from Tyler West's drone footage showing Eagles Ridge at sunrise on Valentine's Day 2022. To most people, it just looks like a beautiful mountain landscape. But Samantha knows what happened there, knows that this image represents both the worst of human nature and the unexpected ways that truth can emerge. She gives talks at law enforcement conferences about cold case investigations, about the importance of new technology, about never giving up on cases that seem unsolvable. And she always tells the story of how a teenage boy's Christmas morning tradition broke open a murder case that had seemed destined to remain forever cold. The Aspen Summit Resort, where all of this took place, struggled with the publicity from the case. For a while, business dropped as people associated the resort with tragedy and murder. But the resort's management made a decision to address the situation head-on. They established new safety protocols for backcountry access, created educational programs about avalanche safety and proper equipment, and worked with law enforcement to install additional surveillance and safety measures in remote areas. They also erected a small memorial marker near the resort's main lodge, dedicated to Victoria Hayes and to the importance of wilderness safety. The resort has recovered its reputation and continues to operate as one of Colorado's premier ski destinations, though staff members still remember the case and use it as a reminder about the importance of monitoring restricted areas. For James Hayes, prison life has been everything he feared. His wealth and status mean nothing behind bars. He's just another inmate serving a life sentence for murder. Reports from the facility indicate he keeps to himself, spends most of his time in the prison library, and has declined all requests for interviews from journalists and documentarians interested in telling his story. He's eligible for basic programming and education, but he will never be eligible for parole, never be released. The $3 million he killed for is gone. The freedom he tried to preserve by murdering his wife is gone. He has nothing left except the knowledge of what he did and the decades of imprisonment that lie ahead. The technology that caught James Hayes has evolved even further since 2022. Drones are more sophisticated, cameras more powerful, and the ability to capture high-quality footage from great distances has only improved. This case has been studied in law enforcement training programs as an example of how everyday technology in the hands of ordinary citizens can become crucial evidence in criminal investigations. It's also served as a cautionary tale for would-be criminals who think they can commit crimes in remote or isolated locations without being observed. In an age of ubiquitous cameras, satellite imagery, and recreational drones, there are very few places where actions go truly unobserved. Tyler West is now 16 years old, a high school junior in Portland, still interested in photography and videography. He doesn't talk much about the case anymore, having moved on with his teenage life, but he's aware that he played a role in bringing a murderer to justice. His parents, Ryan and Megan, have spoken about how the experience affected their family, how it made them more aware of their civic responsibilities, and the importance of coming forward when you witness something wrong. The drone that captured the footage sits in Tyler's room, a piece of technology that became an unlikely instrument of justice. This story reminds us that evidence can come from the most unexpected sources: a teenage boy testing a new drone, a family Christmas tradition of watching vacation videos together, a mother noticing something strange on a screen. These ordinary moments combine to solve a case that professional investigators had nearly given up on. It reminds us that even when someone plans what they believe is the perfect crime, factors beyond their control and imagination can bring truth to light. James Hayes could never have anticipated that someone would be flying a drone in that remote area at that exact moment. He could never have anticipated that the footage would sit unwatched for 10 months before being discovered during a Christmas morning family gathering. The case also highlights the importance of citizen cooperation with law enforcement. The Mitchell Phillips family could have decided that what they saw was ambiguous, that it wasn't their problem, that they didn't want to get involved. But they made the choice to report what they'd seen, to provide the evidence they'd accidentally captured, and that choice led directly to a murderer being brought to justice. Law enforcement officials emphasize that citizen tips and evidence remain some of the most valuable tools in solving crimes. And this case is a perfect example of why people should always report suspicious activity or evidence they might encounter. For those interested in the technical aspects of the case, the drone footage itself has become something of a landmark in forensic evidence. It was one of the first major criminal cases where consumer drone footage played such a pivotal role in securing a conviction. The chain of custody for the evidence, the authentication process, and the enhancement techniques used to maximize the value of the distant footage have all been studied and incorporated into law enforcement best practices. The case established important precedents about the admissibility of drone footage in criminal trials and the standards required for such evidence to be considered reliable. The case has also sparked discussions about privacy, surveillance, and the changing nature of public and private spaces. Some privacy advocates have expressed concern about the implications of consumer drones being able to capture footage of people in remote locations without their knowledge. But legal experts point out that in this case, the individuals being filmed were in a publicly accessible area, even if it was remote and restricted. There was no reasonable expectation of privacy on a mountain peak, and the drone operator had no intention of spying on anyone. The footage was captured incidentally while filming landscape scenes. Courts have generally supported the admissibility of such evidence, finding that the value in solving serious crimes outweighs privacy concerns in situations where the filming was not intentionally invasive. As we reflect on this case, we're reminded of several profound truths. First, that technology has changed the nature of crime and investigation in fundamental ways. Actions that someone might have thought were unobservable 20 years ago can now be captured by devices they never knew existed. Second, that family connections and traditions matter. If the Mitchell Phillips family hadn't maintained their Christmas tradition of watching vacation videos together, that footage might never have been reviewed, and James Hayes might have gotten away with murder. Third, that doing the right thing matters. Victoria Hayes tried to make her husband face consequences for his fraud, and though it cost her life, her courage ultimately led to truth being revealed. This story also serves as a warning about the consequences of greed and desperation. James Hayes had wealth, success, and a life that many would envy. But rather than face accountability for his fraudulent business practices, rather than accept responsibility and consequences, he chose to murder his wife for insurance money. That choice has cost him everything. He'll die in prison, his name forever associated with a particularly calculating and cold-blooded murder. The $3 million he killed for is gone. The reputation he tried to protect is destroyed. And the life he tried to preserve by eliminating the woman who threatened to expose him has been forfeited to the justice system. If you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing to our channel. We cover cold cases, investigations that take unexpected turns, and stories where justice prevails against the odds. Hit that like button if you appreciate in-depth analysis of true crime cases, and turn on notifications so you never miss when we upload new content. In the comments below, share your thoughts. What struck you most about this case? Was it the accidental nature of the evidence discovery? The year-long wait before the footage was reviewed? The role that a family Christmas tradition played in solving a murder? Or the calculated nature of James Hayes' crime? Your engagement helps us understand what types of cases interest our viewers most. Consider sharing this video with others who appreciate true crime stories. Cases like this deserve to be remembered, not just for the tragedy they represent, but for the lessons they teach about technology, civic responsibility, and the unexpected ways that truth can emerge. Every share helps ensure that Victoria Hayes' story reaches people who need to hear it, whether they're potential victims of domestic violence, people struggling with ethical dilemmas, or simply citizens who need reminding about the importance of reporting suspicious activity. If this case affected you emotionally, that's natural and expected. Stories about betrayal, violence, and death are difficult to process, but they're also important to tell and to hear. They remind us that evil exists, but that good people working together can overcome it. They show us that technology, often criticized for its negative effects on society, can also be a powerful tool for justice. And they demonstrate that ordinary people doing ordinary things like flying a drone or watching family videos can make extraordinary differences. Remember to stay aware of your surroundings when you're in wilderness or remote areas. Let people know where you're going and when you expect to return. Trust your instincts if something feels wrong. And understand that even in places that seem isolated, you may be more observable than you think. In an age of cameras, satellites, and drones, privacy is increasingly rare, and actions have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate moment. The story of Victoria and James Hayes, Tyler West's drone footage, and Detective Samantha Ward's determination is ultimately a story about the triumph of truth over deception. James Hayes planned what he thought was the perfect crime. He chose a remote location, a plausible cover story, and a method that would look like an accident. He researched every detail, prepared his performance, and executed his plan. And for more than a year, it appeared he'd succeeded. But he couldn't account for a teenage boy testing a new drone, for a family's Christmas tradition, for a mother's observant eye, or for investigators who refused to give up. Thank you for watching this documentary. Thank you for taking the time to hear Victoria Hayes' story, to understand how justice was served, and to appreciate the role that ordinary citizens played in bringing a murderer to justice. Until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember that the truth, no matter how long it takes, eventually finds the light. Technology records, families remember, and justice, however delayed, still arrives. The drone flew, the camera recorded, a family watched, and a killer who thought he'd gotten away with murder learned that in the modern world, someone is always watching. Even when you think you're alone on a mountaintop on Valentine's Day morning, even when you think you've committed the perfect crime, evidence exists. And sometimes that evidence waits patiently for 10 months until a Christmas morning when a family gathers to watch their vacation videos and accidentally solves a murder that changed their lives and brought justice to a woman who died trying to do the right thing.